in if they will. I know it's a weird time to do this, but this is the time we're doing it. Luckily, the sunlight is agreeing with us. And I have Wi-Fi. The power is on. I'm in my apartment. Hopefully, the electricity gods will agree with us. If y'all weren't here for my last attempt, then know that I was in a place where the power was out. And so this couldn't work. And I was a little annoyed by it, but as I sort of sat with it and thought about, okay, Chloe, let's think about this past week. I was on the road. I was driving to a wedding, and I was on the tail end of that. I had spent a lot of the time preparing this lecture and preparing my guidebook about sect, and everything had gone so well. I felt like I had worked and partied hard in equal measure. And then at the last moment, it felt like fate was like, no, remember your lack of control. Remember that you're dancing with the mystery, baby. And I just had to laugh. It just felt like such a perfect thing for being a night chart, to have my vision thwarted at the last minute and having to be humbled. And hopefully, as I go into this lecture, that will make more sense to you. But yeah, I love sect because it keeps coming up in my life again and again. It continues to be accurate, not just in how I read charts, but how I understand my life. I can see it in everything I do, whether it's, I go to a specific location to get something done, but then what do I do along the way, right? It feels very like the day of going towards the goal, and then the night of, okay, but what am I feeling along the way, right? What is my experience, right? And how those two come together. And so hopefully I can begin to unpack this concept, which ultimately is very simple, is very embodied, I think very basic to being a human on this earth, but hopefully open up its complexities as well. And I'm going to share my presentation soon, but just a quick thing. I'm probably going to be monitoring the chat just to make sure everything is good on my end and everyone's following along. So feel free to drop anything in there if you're called to it, but I'm also going to kind of go with the flow. There's going to be a dedicated Q&A section at the end. So for your big juicy questions, maybe save that towards the end. Yeah, but then otherwise, I think I'm just going to dive in. Thank y'all for being here. And I'm just excited to dive in, and hopefully I will also get you excited. Okay, I'm just checking. Okay, this is what we see. Okay. Okay, so I am calling this the path of day and night, understanding and embodying sect in astrology. And as I, have just been saying, I love this concept because it is so simple. We all know the experience of night and day and how that impacts how we live our lives, how we move through the world, what we do. And it also just is so effective in reading charts. I can't imagine not talking to someone about sect and how that impacts their path and how the different planets function. It's really wild. I mean, you go back to virtually any traditional text, and they'll give different delineations for planets based on if they're in or out of sect, if they're in a night chart or a day chart. But at the same time, when I was researching sect or really wanting to get into the depths, there was plenty of great information out there, but none of it felt, how do I want to put this? None of it felt like it was fully satisfying me. It still felt like I had all of these questions and wanted to go even deeper. And at a certain point, I was just like, Chloe, I think you're just going to have to, figure this out yourself and share that with others. And so I say that also of, this is a starting off point for going deeper. And I encourage you to question and look to yourself and see me not necessarily as an authority, but maybe someone who's done a little bit more research and has read quite a few intense translated texts, but anyway, I do want to name the people who have written about sect and who have impacted my work. I certainly couldn't be here on my own. Particularly, I want to shout out the work of Robert Schmidt, who was the creator of Project Hindsight, a huge figure in bringing traditional, particularly Hellenistic, ancient Greek astrology to the contemporary era. And his work and his deep dive on sect was hugely influential to my understanding of it. But I also very much draw on works of people like Demetra George, Chris Brennan, as well as ancestors like Ptolemy, Porphyry, and Firmicus. His translations I especially really love. So I want to go deeper in this lecture with y'all. This is also just a snippet as well. If the full depth is found in my guidebook, which is available now. But I wanted to help people who maybe didn't understand sect or wanted to see how deep it can go. I wanted to facilitate that in any way and make this information available to others so they can really start employing it in chart readings or in their own life. And I really see sect as helping us kind of understand our version of the good life and how that looks like, what are the contours are, and what success means to us. Because, I mean, something I've been really considering probably my whole life is just how success or this idea can be oppressive to us, and it doesn't have to be, right? Especially if it's something that's given to us. And right, there's a way that sect fits into that as well.
So here is what we will be covering in this lecture. I want this to be accessible to everyone. So if you're new to sect or want to follow along, I highly recommend looking at your chart. So we'll start out with the basics just to kind of get you oriented to what is sect, how to determine the sect of your chart, the planets of each sect, and Mercury, who's his own special case or their own special case, and then sect and dignity. If sect does not act as an essential dignity, right, like a domicile or an exaltation, what does it tell us about a planet? And then we have something a little more subjective, a little more about applying sect to our own life and our own path of success. So we're going to get into the diurnal and nocturnal path, what being a day and night chart tells us about ourselves, understanding planets in and out of sect and how they function, mixed sect or how the two sects combine in our chart. And then we're going to get into how to embody the day and night and your unique path to the good life, how these two parts of our lives, to the two parts of the day, how do they come together to create a whole? But before we get into that, I wanted us to get back to our experience of sect, which comes first and foremost through our lives, through what we see and sense. So I just invite you to come back to your body, get into a comfortable pose, take a few deep breaths, and just conjure up a vision of the day. Maybe you're watching this during the day. Maybe there's a certain memory. Whatever comes forward, just sit with that, right? And notice, how do you feel? Can you see? What is the quality of light? Are there people around? What are they doing? What do you want to do? What is the quality that you feel within yourself as you walk out into the light and join everything else that is around you? And as you sink into that, I will recite the Orphic hymn to the sun. Hear, golden Titan, whose eternal eye with matchless sight illumines all the sky, native unwearied in diffusing light, and to all eyes the object of delight. Lord of the seasons, beaming light from far, sonorous dancing in thy four-yoked car. With thy right hand the source of morning light, and with thy left the father of the night. Agile and vigorous, venerable sun, fiery and bright around the heavens you run. Foe to the wicked, but the good man's guide. O'er all steps propitious you reside. With various sounding golden lyre, 'tis thine to fill the world with harmony divine. Father of ages, guide of prosperous deeds, the world's commander, born by lucid steeds. Immortal Jove, flute playing, bearing light, source of existence, pure and fiery bright. Bearer of fruit, almighty Lord of years, agile and warm, whom every power reveres. Bright eye that round the world incessant flies, doomed with fair fulgid rays to set and rise. Dispensing justice, lover of the stream, the world's great master and o'er all supreme. Faithful defender in the eye of right, of seeds the ruler and of life the light. With sounding whip for fiery steeds you guide, when in the glittering car of day you ride, propitious on these mystic labors shine, and bless thy suppliants with a life divine. You can take some time to come back to here, feel into your body, because we're going to do this again with the night. Again, conjure or feel into a scene when the sun is not out. Notice what you can see and sense, how that's maybe different than what you can see in the day. Pay attention to how you feel, what you're seeing within, what visions the darkness is conjuring in you. Can you see things around you? What are they doing? What do you want to do? As you explore this terrain, I will recite the Orphic hymn to the night. Nyx, parent goddess, source of sweet repose, from whom at first both gods and men arose. Here blessed Venus, decked with starry light, in sleep's deep silence, dwelling ebon night. Dream and soft case attend thy dusky train, pleased with the lengthened gloom and feetful strain. Dissolving anxious care, the friend of mirth, with darkling coursers riding round the earth. Goddess of phantoms and of shadowy play, whose drowsy power divides the natural day. By fate's decree, you constant send to the light to deepest hell, remote from mortal sight. For dire necessity which not withstands, invest the world with adamantine bands. Be present, goddess, to thy suppliant's prayer, desired by all, whom all alike revere. Blessed, benevolent, with friendly aid, dispel the fear of twilight's dreadful shade. Now take some time to come back to your body, to come back to present, and we'll continue the lecture.
Great. So what is sect? As I hopefully just illustrated, right? It's the difference between night and day. And it affirms the connection between astrology and what we see from Earth. That, our sense perceptions and view of the sky matters to how our chart functions, right? It makes total sense in some ways that the quality of light when you're born, right, impacts, right, the terrain in which you walk. Right, and that is another definition I have here for sect, right? It is a fundamental orientation of the natal chart, right? It's kind of the ground on which you stand. And I use the word orientation here really specifically, as in it's where we're going and how we get there, right? Are you moving through the light of the day or the dark of the night? And that'll impact not just the method that you move through, but what is your aim in this terrain? Sect also creates two parties or alliances of planets. The Greek word for sect is haresis, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but basically means like sect or faction. You can see it like two political parties. And right, depending on the sect of your chart, you'll have a set of planets that are in alignment to your natal terrain, and you'll have a set of planets that are counter to your natal terrain. So luckily, determining if you're a night or day chart is usually pretty easy. You have to know your birth time, but generally even that will tell you, right? If you're born at midnight, you're probably a night chart. And if you're born at noon, you're probably a day chart. But you can also look at your own natal chart to figure out. You just have to look for the sun, which is a circle with a dot in it. And you'll see if the sun is above this AC-DC, this ascendant-descendant line, they're always opposite each other, then you are born in the day. And if the sun was located below this ascendant-descendant line, this horizon point, then you're a night chart. The only time where I would consider that more complicated is if your sun is within 6 degrees of the ascendant or the descendant. I definitely see these people having more ambiguous, mixed experiences of sect. Like you see here, Scarlett Johansson, her sun is like exactly conjoined her horizon point. And so I think it's a little more complicated than that. And I get more into that in my book, and I'm going to get more into that later in the presentation as well. Okay, so each sect also has a set of planets. It's a really nice symmetry. There's always a luminary, right? A planet of light, a benefic, a planet that brings good things, and a malefic, a planet that brings difficulty, assigned to each sect. And so the day sect planets are the sun, the benefic is Jupiter, the malefic is Saturn. And so if you were born in the day, right, these are in sect for you. And then the night planets are the moon, the benefic is Venus, and then the malefic is Mars. The only one who's got to be different, of course, we love them for this, is Mercury, which I kind of describe as both and neither. And you might have heard, and this is definitely something I believe for a long time, that Mercury changes sect based on solar phase, if he rises or they rise before or after the sun. But the more I've spent time with Mercury and just contemplated his nature and honestly done research on sect, I don't think you can really pigeonhole them to wholly nocturnal and wholly diurnal, right? So Antiochus says that Hermes or Mercury becomes common in relation to the sex, or partaking in both sects in some way, but not really belonging to either, right? And is good with the good planets and becomes malefic with the malefics. Basically, Mercury is very impressionable. They like to merge with whatever they're around. And so I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this, but just know that I think Mercury is just as complicated as their placement in your chart, right? So pay attention to solar phase, to the sign, to their aspects, to the terms, and just trust that, you know, Mercury makes do with both the day and the night pretty well. So just to reiterate, this is just a quick and easy guide for what are your planets in and out of sect. So right, if you're born in the day, the sun, Jupiter, and Saturn are in sect for you. And then the moon, Venus, and Mars are out of sect. If you're born in the night, then the moon, Venus, and Mars are in sect. And then the sun, Jupiter, and Saturn are out of sect. And then I put Mercury over here as common because they're always doing their own thing and making their own way, which we love for them. Okay. So what does sect tell us about a planet? As in, it's not essential dignity, right? Like domiciles or exaltations, but it does do something. So as Demetra George puts it, right, this is not a planet's power or resources, which I really associate with essential dignity. A planet's sect status determines how much authority and freedom a planet has to bring forth its positive significations on behalf of the individual, right? So this authority and freedom of a planet, right? There's something about being in sect that gives them more power in some ways and more liberty to move how they will. And it makes their ultimate manifestation or culmination for the native much more beneficial. So what I've seen and experienced is an insect planet, right, is more comfortable, feels more ease, and can function in what we consider the more proper way or normal way, whatever that may mean for the planet. I really like this metaphor I got from Austin Coppock, where he describes seeing sect as the day versus the night shift at a place where, right, if you're born during the day planets are used to being up at that time. They understand the rules of the day shift. They feel comfortable. They are in charge. And then, right, the night shift has to come in. They're probably cranky. They don't know where everything is. They have a different way of doing things, and they have to somehow adapt to this foreign terrain, which I am trying to kind of show with this picture of this woman in a party dress in an office, where it's like, I'm sure, she's here to party, but the office is maybe not going to lend the most ease and comfort to do that about. And then the big thing, and this is something I really want to emphasize with sect, is that it really answers the question, is a planet enjoying itself? Right. Okay. So you really see this idea of sect and enjoyment throughout the tradition with this idea of rejoicing. You might have heard of planetary joys or specific houses that the planets like to be in. And you'll notice that it all conforms to sect. So the diurnal planets, the sun, Jupiter and Saturn all rejoice in houses above the horizon. And then the nocturnal planets, Mars, Venus, and Moon, rejoice below the horizon. And then Mercury, of course, existing betwixt and between, rejoices in the first house, which is where night and day, heaven and earth meet. But you see rejoicing throughout the tradition. There's many different ways a planet can rejoice. There's rejoicing by sign, rejoicing by solar phase, and by hemisphere. I'm not going to get too into those last two because they're kind of technical, but I do get really into it in my sect guidebook. But rejoicing by sign is pretty simple, right? So the fire and air signs are considered diurnal, and then the earth and water signs are considered nocturnal. So, for example, if you have a diurnal planet like the sun in Sagittarius or Libra, right, regardless of essential dignity, like that planet is seen to be rejoicing. But that can only happen when the planet is of sect, right? Only planets in sect can rejoice. So, for example, right, I have my sun in Sagittarius, which is a diurnal planet and a diurnal sign. But because I'm a night chart, he can't rejoice. And you really see this highlighted too with Robert Schmidt talking about insect planets being altered in the direction of more benefic, i.e., more conducive to harmony and connection. Even malefics, and I've definitely noticed this, and I'll really go to bat for this. You're out of your insect malefic. Many will argue, Robert Schmidt, a lot of the text will say your insect malefic is not actually a malefic. Like, sure, they can still cause problems, but there's a product, there's a positivity, there's an ultimate, what do I want to say? There's an ultimate benefit to engaging with your insect malefic. And that goes not just for it natally, but transit wise. I, as a night chart, experience Mars transits as way less intense than my day planet brethren. But yeah, as I was kind of saying before, right, imagining your chart as an environment, and just imagine, right, how would, right, in the shroud of night, how would planets that are used to functioning in the day, right, in the clear light of day, how would they function, and vice versa in the light of day, right? What are the more kind of mysterious and spooky planets? Sorry, my cat is trying to knock over a glass of water. Yeah, what are they about, right? They have to do something there. And so this is what I really want to get into now is walking your path and kind of really beginning to use sect to understand your terrain, how you're walking it, the complexities of your story, and hopefully, right, give a place to all the planets. But the first thing we want to do is understand the sect of your chart, i.e. the terrain and the path. And this was, ultimately the thing that started my interest in sect is like, I loved the idea of being in the night chart. It made so much sense to me, but I knew there was so many more contours to it than what I could find previously out there. So first we'll talk about the diurnal path. And I will be using the metaphor of Apollo versus Dionysus, which is something I got from Austin Coppock, but first originated from Friedrich Nietzsche, who used them to kind of divide the two poles of kind of aesthetic or artistic concerns. Right, Apollo, of course, is the god of the sun. It makes sense that he would represent the diurnal. Even this painting of him by Hendrik Goltzius, I think, that encapsulates the diurnal path so much, where you see him and he's far away, right? You can see all of him. He's naked. He's very in like high definition. Every single one of his abs is clear to us, but he's up in the sky, right? He's not on Earth. He's floating in the clouds. There's, I believe that is the chariot of the sun being pulled, but they're not quite close to each other. He has a wand kind of centering his energy and lifting him upwards, and he's not looking at us, right? He's looking even further upward. He has this golden halo, this nimbus around himself. Just everything about him is just like pure like energy and light and potential. And you see that too in some of the other qualities that he's assigned or the god of, right? So music and dance and poetry, right? These are all art forms that were considered especially civilized or prized by a lot of the Greek philosophers because, for example, the movement of dancing or right the ordering like of the The circle of fifths in music was said to mimic the movement of the heavenly spheres and just get us closer to the divine. And that's a really big thing I see with day charts and just the diurnal path in general, is like the power of like ideals, or like this core potential sense of self that feels divine, that feels God given. Like that is sort of what leads the path, right? And with that, right, being the God of light, of truth and prophecy, there's a clear and far seeing that being born in the day affords you. I mean, it just makes sense. I mean, you can see where things begin and end much more clearly in the day. You can understand the divisions between things. And with that, you can also see things from afar, right? There's a very philosophical, systematic thinking to day charts. Like they're able to just like distill like a bunch of complicated things down to their essence and really understand the core of things. I've seen day charts, and I'm making a huge generalization with this. So please, if it doesn't, resonate with you, like follow that. But I've seen a lot of day charts like work well within systems or institutions, or creating their own systems and institutions. Right, just things that require, right, you do this and then do that and you follow that, and they can follow that path because the light of day allows them to see. But there's also, I mean, this exaltation of the individual, right, and your own potential power and ability to shape the outside world with the day path. Yeah, there's just like this like beautiful shininess to the day path of like, I kind of like imagine it as like, virtually any heroic story. I mean, I associate the epic hero, right? The individual who is divinely ordained, who is here to do something specific. And when they're born, they might not feel it. They might have to grow into it or act into it, but that potential, right, is always there. And that's why another word that I really associate with the day is action, right? I mean, the sun is, right, what provides us energy, right? Is what, in medical astrology, the sun is kind of like our base store of energy. So there's a really strong emphasis on for diurnal charts to act, right? To not just let their sense of self be theoretical or in their head, but to create the world in their image, so to speak. And that's why I also see, right, this idea of like objectivity being a thing, and not so much as that, diurnal charts aren't objective, right? I really see these as, two sides of the same coin, right? Maybe just different spectrum or different ratios of the same thing, right? It's more just the quality, the power of things that are objectively true, or doing things like, I guess a way I try to describe it is, sure, maybe you learned a lot in a competition or applying for a job, but ultimately the day sect is about, okay, but did you get the job, right? Did you do the thing or did you not? And that is really where the power is, and where I really see day charts shaping their identity is like, right, making it exterior in some way. It's, I'm talking to day chart friends. It's also it's often this thing where it's like they have to do the thing to get the, to believe that they are that thing. And that doesn't have to mean, how everyone sees it and everyone loves it, but more that if you want to be a painter, just get a set of paints and start messing around, right? And that is kind of how, this interior, right, divine spark is formed. What else did I want to say? Just the identity, the individual, but this individual that is trying to, right, transcend limits or transcend this physical world, in a sense of trying to get higher, right? Spirit, I kind of use this spirit soul dichotomy from this Zen writer named John Tarrant. And spirit, he talks about, is the part of, right, our divine spark that wants to lift ever higher and to get closer to ideals and get closer to ultimately that sense of oneness with everything. But it's, right, while also being in dialogue with being an individual. So I like creating metaphors or giving people concrete things to hold on to. So I like describing the diurnal path as being like on a mythic quest. Right? There's, I think Lord of the Rings is such a good example. I mean, these hobbits, right? Who are they supposed to be? Well, they're supposed to save the whole world, right? And maybe they don't feel it, and maybe they have to do it in unconventional ways, but they know the path in front of them, right? There's specific things they have to do. And, right, you either destroy the ring or you don't. But it is through those actions that they become the hero, that they become the self, like that the path needs. And so the ultimate question, right, is can you prove yourself out in the world? Can you and a big thing too, I want to emphasize with diurnal charts, right, is like this philosophical ability to find the meaning in anything, right? Regardless of what life throws at you, right? Day charts are really good at being, well, I see how that fits into the whole. I see how I can work with that and turn that into fodder for my ultimate activities. Okay, then next we have the nocturnal path, which is represented here by Dionysus. And I just love these images of these two gods so much because they're made by the same guy, but they really couldn't be any different, right? Apollo was up in the heavens. Dionysus here is on earth. He's up close, right? He has this ornate frame around him. He's bedecked in finery and vines. He has, a little satyr really close to him. He's also looking at the viewer, right? His face is kind of half shrouded. He looks a little tricky. I don't fully trust him, but I do want to see what he wants from me, right? And I think that really starts to translate the intimacy, the closeness, for better or for worse, of the nocturnal path versus, I think, the big view of the day path. And so Dionysus is the god of winemaking, orchards and fruit, vegetation, fertility, festivity, insanity, ritual madness, religious ecstasy, and theater, right? So things that are very terrestrial, very chthonic, right? The growth and decay of things, but also the ability of that plant material to alter our minds and kind of take us out of our normal consciousness. And that's the thing that I really see with day charts is, right, not so much a concern for the single identity, but right, what are the ways that I am not myself, whether that be through exploring the unconscious, exploring, right, altered state, religious ecstasy, right, with ecstasy, the Greek word is like ecstasis, to be outside of oneself, right, so the God can enter. Right, but as well as like, how am I not myself, as in, how do I join the plurality, right? Things like, festivity and ritual sort of tunes us into other bodies and other people. And something that Robert Schmidt really associates with the night sect is this idea of the public, not so much as in like, right, what is visible, but what is like amongst the many. And a question that I feel like night charts, it behooves to ask is, right, not necessarily, right, how am I different, but how am I like everyone else? How am I like everything else? And how is that a strength of mine? And with that, embodiment is a huge thing rather than like existing right in the intellect. It's about, okay, what is my body telling me? Knowing that, right, like the body is slower, the body doesn't follow logic, but there's right there, that's where our intuition lies as well. And I often find as a night chart, it's like, and other night charts too, it's like we kind of walk our path in a gut feeling sort of way of like, well, this feels right. And I don't know why. And maybe it's kind of silly, but it just feels right. And I'm going to take that next most beautiful step. And with that, subjectivity, I think, is really emphasized for the nocturnal path of like, right, there's no, I feel this emotion and there's no, right, now maybe someone else wouldn't respond to this situation in this way, but that subjective experience is real. Or at the same time, right, I mean, you see this even in, right, trusting that your path doesn't have to follow some like objective standard of success as much. And I wouldn't necessarily say that about diurnal charts, but I think it's more about trusting that things that will be specific to you, right? Something that might be a failure to someone else might be a success to you. And with that, whereas I think the day is much more about action and following through, the night is much more about trust, which hopefully this technological mishap has emphasized to y'all. It's right, because I'll also say, like, I'm a night chart, but I'm ruled by the sun, right? I I try to be diurnal maybe more than I should. So this desire to effort doesn't necessarily yield the best results. It's more like taking some time to receive, notice where things go, and letting things change on their own, right? There's a sense of, right, being much more subject to contingency, right? Letting life, right, be mysterious, right? Letting it be shadowy and not necessarily thinking you have all the answers, right? Because at night, you can't see as much. And just the same as you can't see as much outside, like our inner world of dreams and nightmares, right? We begin to project onto the night, thus making, right, our subjective experience much more loud. But with that, there's also a reveling in, right, in matter and its and its limits and its, it's kind of animalistic nature. And so with that, I would liken the nocturnal path to being in a dream, right? Which is, on the one hand, right, the dreamer creates the dream as, they walk it, but the dream also creates the dreamer. Depth psychologist James Hillman tells us that only the dreamer himself can interpret the dream, and that dreams are best understood as having a multiplicity of meanings. We're not meant to say this is what it means, but to understand it from many different perspectives, right? And also that, our dream symbolism is, right, so unique to us, right? What is a bad omen to one person, right, is a great omen to another. And so I see the question as the nocturnal path as, can you trust your inner mystery, right? Can you trust the part of you and the part of life that's always surprising you? And can you make a path with that? Okay. Just gonna check the chat really quick. Great. Okay. All good. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about planets in sect, right, which act as helpers or pathfinders on your larger terrain. Let's see. Okay, so planets in sect, what does it mean? Right, well, first of all, their basic nature is in harmony with the environment. Thus, they can act more smoothly and effectively. They can rejoice or find feelings of comfort and ease in the chart. And this is another Robert Schmidt thing. He says the testimony in the chart is strong, right? So there's this idea in Hellenistic Greek astrology that you can see each of the planets as like having their own voice in the chart and having their own agenda. And, your life is sort of like being decided by this table of 7 planets who are each witnessing and giving their own opinion on your life. And there, he mentions that planets in sect, right, are more able, right, their testimony, what they want, or, testify for the native is stronger, right? There's just, right, all different ways of saying there's just a greater effectiveness to insect planets. And yeah, I want to talk about that briefly with Sylvia Plath's chart, because she, I think, really highlights day versus night as a day chart, right? So she has a day chart. So her insect planets are going to be her Saturn in the 12th, her Sun in the 10th, and her Jupiter in the 8th. And I find Sylvia Plath a really interesting day chart because, right, she obviously talks about very deep, intense, emotional subjects, right? But she does so to advance her career and sense of self as like a sovereign being, right? I mean, it's really interesting reading about her. She was given awards and scholarships and fellowships for writing since she was a teenager. She was very early on lauded for her singular achievements. So I've put here that, right, she's led by those achievements, by her writerly ambitions, of which she had many, and her externalizing, her making, right, her taking her dark, difficult subjects, right? She struggled with mental health. She spent a lot of time in institutions, right? That is fodder and became, right, something that a huge part of her identity, that it was able to inspire and help, other people like who were feeling what she was feeling, right, feel a sense of connection. And something else I found really interesting reading about her is that most of her, right, friendships and relationships came through her writing opportunities. Like, she befriended other writers. She met her husband, who was also a writer. But I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is that, right, these day planets that were about who is Sylvia and what is she here to do, right, when those were leading the charge, right, and the rest kind of fell in place around it. So one way, right, to kind of extend the mythic quest dream metaphor is to, right, see the insect planets as, right, likely characters you would find in this terrain. You, right, the sun, of course, would be the hero, right, the protagonist, right, leading the charge and forging their sense of self. Jupiter is like the wizard or advisor giving advice and, what is it? Weird prophetic musings along the way. And Saturn's kind of like the anti-hero, right? The rogue who maybe is not down with the party and wants to do things their own way, but then eventually joins up and right helps give the sun a different perspective and maybe try his, hone his stuff a little more than if Saturn wasn't there. And then for the dream, the moon would be like the dreamer, right? The person making, but also being impacted by this shifting nightscape. Venus is the object of desire, right? The thing, whatever it will be for you that you want in the dream. And then Mars is the shadow, maybe the part of the dream that's, oh, that's not me, or oh, I don't want to be like that person or that thing, but it's there. It's part of your psyche, right? How do you integrate that that part of you, knowing that there's a greater wholeness in having that. Okay. So next we're going to talk about planets out of sect, right? The rogues or the fish out of water, right? Who don't necessarily vibe with the environment, but have to make do in some way. And so, right, they're out of place in their environment. Thus, they're going to be more awkward and potentially make more mistakes, right? They can't function in their normal way. Can't rejoice. The base level of comfort and ease is not going to be as present for them. And their testimony in the chart, or their ability, right, to bring forth their agenda, is going to be weaker or going to be more easy to override. So with Sylvia Plath being a day chart, her moon, Venus, and Mars are out of sect. That's a typo. And the way I put it is she struggles when her relationships, emotions, and interior beliefs take the lead. And I more mean this in, right, obviously she was an extremely emotional and emotionally complex person, but more that I just can't help but think of her in her time. She grew up in, I think, the 50s and 60s, right? I mean, she was not very old when she died, but I mean, I can't imagine being like a woman at the time who was very successful, also having to be the perfect housewife, right? She had children. She was married to another poet who was probably very jealous of her and actually was extremely detrimental to her mental health and to her career ultimately, right? And you see this here with her out of sect malefic, right? Which I'll say, right? So your out of sect malefic is just going to be difficult for you. Where it is in your chart is going to describe sort of like a natal promise of difficulty. And then the, transiting Mars for day charts, for example, is going to be more difficult for y'all. So she has her out of sect malefic in the 7th house of relationships. And so her husband, Ted Hughes, ultimately left her for another woman. After her death, he destroyed her final notebook and what else? And delayed the publishing of a lot of her other work. And, him and his sister were very, very controlling of her narrative and her legacy because they didn't actually divorce. So he was still in charge of all of her estate. But here you see, it's like, right, letting this man, beyond her control, letting this relationship take precedence over her own expression and career, right, had an extremely detrimental effect, right, which you also see by, right, her Mars, squaring her very public, right, sun in the 10th, right, which is all about like the sense of self, coming out into the world, being seen, having a very visible career, right, that was, directly harmed by this out of sect planet that was more towards, oh, let me try figuring out relationships, let me follow his lead. Well, he didn't have her best interest at heart. Right. And so I also just want to emphasize it's not necessarily like you'll just have to look at your out of sect planets and be like, it's not going to work. I think it's more like understanding their exact place. And right. And for her, if we're following sect, it would tell us that, right, the right relationship would not hamper her career. If she follows that, then more would fall into place. So my metaphor for the planets out of sect, for the diurnal planets or mythic quest, the moon would be like the witch, right? Who could be the foe or just kind of like a tertiary character off to the side, never really emphasized as much. Venus would be the maiden, right? The one who maybe they're searching for, or the damsel. But, once again, most mythic quests are not from the point of view of the maiden. She's often not given much to do. And then Mars is the ruthless foe, right? The one who could thwart the hero's plans and, yeah, take it all away. And then for the dream or the nocturnal metaphor, you could see this on like the lucid dreamer. Like I like, Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks, right? Is someone from the waking world who, right, maybe can't stay too long in the dream world or doesn't, can control it, but, isn't maybe getting the same, juice out of the dream as if he were just in it. Jupiter is the interpreter, the one basically saying, this is what it means, right? This is the static meaning. There's nothing else to it. And Saturn's the nightmare, right? Which, right, ultimately, I've heard many stories of people, right, facing nightmares and being able to transform by, facing these fears. But we don't really have a choice, right? We don't know if we're lucid. We're often just thrust into the dream and just having to deal with fear. And I feel like that's a good metaphor for Saturn in a night chart, personally speaking. But right, let's consider the way that sect mixes and complicates in your chart, because it's very rare that, right, a day chart has very loud day planets and then the night planets are all pushed off to the side or they're not all talking to each other. So yeah, I really wanted to get into, right, the richness, the conflict of your story. How do these two, right, really begin to come together? So one way of bringing the day and night together, I was really inspired by this psychoanalyst and writer Adam Phillips, and this is from an essay that he has on success. And he says, it can be useful to think of ourselves as multiple personalities, of our internal worlds as more like a novel than a monologue. Each character or part of ourselves has different projects and different criteria for success. Certain voices become muted. Because our different selves have different projects, success and failure are inextricable. This does not entail ironing out the conflicts, but rather extending the repertoire of ways of describing them. And then this other quote I really like is, anyone who is failing at one thing is succeeding at another. And this is something that I want you to start to think about as you approach your in and out of sect planets, because a way that I've experienced a lot of my out of sect stuff is like dealing with this idea of failure or not meeting the mark or, right, expectations. But I really like this kind of duality of two things happening at once, because it's very true where, when I failed at something, right, I failed at winning a certain award or getting into a certain right program that I really wanted to get into. What I was succeeding at was having to forge my own way, was not following maybe a certain legible path to then walk a path that was way more mysterious to me. I mean, I talked about this in one of my newsletters. After graduating college, a few weeks before even, I had no idea what I was going to do. All of my plans fell through. I felt completely pessimistic. But then suddenly this voice inside of me remembered, oh, wow. But I did say years ago that I was going to return to the Zen monastery and stay there for at least a year. So why don't I just do that? Right. But I had to fail at my first plan to succeed at ultimately what was truly for me. And I see this too with, Sylvia's Sun in Scorpio and Mars in Leo. You'll notice that they're actually in mutual reception, right? So Scorpio is ruled by Mars and her Mars is then ruled by the Sun. And so there's this interesting tension. They're obviously very related, right? Her relationships and her career, but they're also square each other, right? Which is a tense aspect. And so one way I see squares is like, if you're taking care of one planet, then you're actively hurting the other planet. So you see this tension of like, right, as she was, her husband was obviously very tied up in her career, but as she was taking care of her career, there was a tension with her husband. And as she was tending to her relationship, right, there was a tension with the Sun. And yeah, and I encourage you to, right, also consider, right, like maybe there are ways where you like have to do, an out of sect planet, and it feels awkward and it feels weird. But really begin to also think, okay, if I can't do this in the normal way, how can I do it my way, right? What new possibilities open up when we don't necessarily need to get it all right on the first try, especially with out of sect planets. And so I wanted to also kind of speak to, right, how to maybe understand or delineate more complicated manifestation of sect, right? Because, as I mentioned, right, I mean, a big question I've had my whole life is just like, right, how do I be a night chart ruled by a day planet, right? And we see this as well. Jeff Buckley, who's a famous musician from the 90s, is also a Leo rising, right, ruled by the sun uh, night chart. So one way I have been seeing this combination, right, is the native must walk that planet's path using methods counter to the planet's nature and with a bit more discomfort. And Jeff Buckley is a really loud story of this, right? So for years, he tried to make it as a musician in New York. He wasn't getting a record deal. No one really cared until finally he agreed to be part of this concert honoring his late father, Tim Buckley, who was also a very famous musician, but he wasn't really involved in Jeff's life. He, wasn't really a big figure, but he had to use his familial connections to finally get a foot in the door. And then he got a record deal, and then his talent was recognized, right? But the Sun on their own, the Sun is about sovereignty, right? And the individual. The Sun does not want to rely on their relationships. They just want to rely on their talent and their shine to be seen. So you see how he had to be a bit more collaborative, a bit more nocturnal to bring forth his solar agenda. So some other mixed sect conditions. One is, right, a planet ruled by an out of sect planet, right? So a planet that must use tools and resources of the contrary sect to accomplish their agenda. So we see this with Courtney Love, who is a day chart, right? We see her sun is in the 10th house here, but her sun is in Cancer, right? It's ruled by the moon, her out of sect planet. And something interesting about Courtney Love is she really, in a very public way, embodies like this sun moon dichotomy, where she's, right? I mean, I want to be with the girl with the most cake, she says. I want to be both the prom queen and the football star. She didn't just want to date the rock star, right? She wanted to be the rock star. And some would argue that, her music is up there with Kurt, her Kurt Cobain, her late husband. And so one of the ways I see that is like, right, her sun, right, her luminary of sect, all about, right, her core sense of self.
That's enough.
Had to follow relationships. She was always associated with Kurt, for better or for worse, and right, because of misogyny, often painted in a negative light because of that relationship, because she could never measure up to this person whom she loved, right? And then on the flip side, an out of sect planet, right, or out of sect planet ruled by a planet insect, right, their methods are more comfortable or helpful to the native. And I actually, this was for this. Is this for this one? I kind of did this wrong, but this was for Megan Fox's chart, right? So she is a night chart. She has her sun below the horizon, but she's a Taurus Venus, right? She, not Taurus Venus. She is a Taurus sun. So her sun is ruled by her benefic of sect Venus. And so one way that her identity manifests, right, is through her beauty, right? And through her allure as, right, one of the, most conventionally attractive women in Hollywood. And so, right, through her, and as well as her relationships, right, she was very big part of her public identity. So you can see how, like, right, this out of sect planet is a bit more approachable to her because of that. And then finally, angular out of sect planets, right? Concerns counter to or unnatural to the path of the native will be quite loud in their story, right? So coming back to the moon, right?
How about you, Sophie? How about you, Ted?
Whether she liked it or not, her concerns around family, her very intimate life, right? Stuff around her pregnancy, were public in a way that was extremely uncomfortable for her. But nevertheless, right, her role as a mother and people's opinions on that was something that she, had to reckon with in a pretty powerful way. So another mixed sect topic I wanted to bring up is sunrise and sunset charts, and maybe begin to unpack what are the experience of ambiguous sect, because I always feel kind of bad. It's like there is a real thing where if you're born really close to the horizon, right, planets of both sects are going to be more neutral they're going to experience both Mars and Saturn as like relatively malefic, and then Venus and Jupiter as relatively benefic. And like I said, I use a pretty tight orb, look for the sun within 6 degrees. But more than that, pay attention to your experience and how, the different transits of the planets impact you. I have whole essays kind of getting into the kind of poetic quality of like dawn versus dusk births, because I think there's a lot of potential there. But know that this is really just the beginning. And I'm really excited to see if there's any, ambiguous sect people out there who want to kind of take it further. But one way that I've described dawn folks, right, is that they feel much more cloudy or hazy on the contours of their plan, right? They don't have the full, maybe diurnal vision until the crucial flash of insight suddenly illuminates the whole, right? There's just thinking about what it's like to wake up, the energy you can have, the suddenly burst into consciousness after a whole night of dreaming, right? There's all of this like nocturnal material for dawn people to draw from. And so I associated this kind of nativity as well with, right, focus on initiation, right, the beginning of the action and maintaining that sense of novelty, maybe more important to sunrise births, beginnings, right, and creativity, just thinking of what is creativity, but, drawing from like the prima materia void of the nocturnal and turning it into something real, right, into something that visible, the diurnal. And then on the other side, we have dusk births, right, who have spent, all this time out in the day, but now the night is creeping in. Now shadows grow longer and contours grow more hazy. And so I talk about dusk requiring the use of diurnal skills, right, what they've just drawn from, namely direct action, clear seeing, and the movement towards ideals in the shadowy realm of night, emotions, intimacy, and chaos, right? So there's a much bigger focus on endings, right? Seeing things through to completion and really focusing on how things finish are really important for dusk charts, as are altered states, thinking about like, right, being in that liminal space where you still have your sense faculties, but they start to blur and maybe be attuned to other worlds, I think is a thing I see with dusk charts. And then prophecy, right, with the ability to kind of see beyond maybe the physical and material. They can have very profound psychic insights. So the next thing when walking your path is to consider how our context impacts our path, right? I.e., we live in a sun cult. And my friends and I first came up with this phrase, basically around, the reduction of astrology to sun sign horoscopes, which happened 100 years ago by this guy, Alan Leo, to make astrology more popular. But now everyone is like, astrology isn't real. Not all Taurus suns are the same. And it's like, you're right. We do agree on that. Right. But it's, sun cult is so much more than that. I mean, I just use it in any way that our society, and our society does this a lot, where they reduce the idea of like the good life and to not just one path, but to one specific type of person. Right. We see this with the myth of the lone genius, this idea that someone, does it all by themselves, like through the grit of their own, genius ideas without any help from anyone else. Right. Capitalism and the necessity of profit, which tells us that only things that have objective monetary value are worth anything. And with that, the overvaluation of STEM and the denigration of humanities, which a lot comes from, right? A lot of there's not necessarily one specific right way to interpret a poem or to understand history or, feel about a piece of art. And that moves away from the sun cult's overvaluation of objectivity. And I also really want to emphasize here that while on the surface, day charts might have an easier time with sun cult, the sun cult does not serve day charts either, because in an ideal world, everyone could be, right, their full sovereign unique self following their unique path, right? But sun cult says, right, as we see with, the current administration's, segregation policies and rollback of DEI, is that anyone who does not a white man in power is suddenly suspect, and their ability to act and live in the world is hindered. The devaluation of care work, right? Once again, something that we don't put a monetary value on as part of Sun Cult, as well as turning masculinity into domination violence, right? That the only way to be powerful is to impose your will on other people, thus preventing them from being sovereign. And so I just mentioned this because making your own way can feel like an uphill battle when, especially in America, we have very rigid ideas about what success looks like or how a successful person should look like. So next, right, this is going to be more subjective, suggestive. We're going to try to get into how does the day and night come together in your chart, right? How do you begin to form the narrative and use these pieces to see the whole? So, right, the first thing, right, is to just, right, understand the roles of the planets in your chart, right? The sect of the chart and the planets of sect describe the dominant narrative where ease and enjoyment lies. The planets out of sect describe the counter narrative, learning to work within the strictures of the chart and tell its own story, even if it doesn't fit into the dominant narrative. So one way I see this, right, is with the chart of Kurt Cobain. And I think he's a really emblematic description of, like, right, you know, how sect is different from essential dignity as well, where he has Jupiter, right? So he's a night chart, right? His sun is pretty well below the horizon. So that would make Jupiter over here his out of sect benefic. And by all accounts, this is a strong Jupiter. Like, it's retrograde, but he's rejoicing in the 11th. He's exalted in Cancer. He's co-present his ruler, the moon. And this Jupiter in Cancer in the house of audiences, like, is pretty loudly translates to, oh, he was really popular and became this voice for a whole generation of people. But the truth was, he hated that. Right? He did not want to be this famous. He wanted to be a successful musician, but more like a niche, you know, underground musician. So, right, this counter, you know, so he has this one narrative, right? This nocturnal narrative of, you know, creativity and relationships and finding his voice and dealing with his relationship to, like, addiction in his body. But then there's this very loud counter narrative that, of course, is, you know, more public of, well, he had all this fame and he had this, you know, felt pressure from other people of how do I be myself and how do I show up? And yeah, I almost wonder what would something have been different if there would have been this understanding that, okay, this is your fate, right? There's this Jupiter is here. It's maybe not where most of the ease is. So how can you balance that with your more nocturnal self? Right. Well, understanding that the tools and the goal of the contrary sect should ultimately serve the dominant narrative, right? How could he make that exalted Jupiter work for him? And, you know, he kind of did by, you know, messing around in interviews and, you know, doing, you know, and sharing his views and maybe being controversial, but ultimately being like, you know, if there's any racist or homophobes, you know, in my audience, please F off. I don't want you to be here. That feels like a very nocturnal way to handle this, like, wide diurnal audience. But then with that, you know, understanding the continuum of success and failure, right? How and when are we doing both, right? And how does sect help us understand that? Well, also understanding, right, that sun cult and conventional forms of success, right, are going to kind of require us to, you know, come back to again and again, right? What is true to you and what ideas of success, right, maybe are antiquated. But ultimately, right, understand, like, the sect of the planets and let that guide you. Nocturnal planets, right, are going to maybe point towards more nocturnal, more intimate forms of success. It's like nocturnal is much more about, like, did you feel good, right? Were you satisfied while you did it? And then diurnal is going to be more, okay, but did you do the thing, right? Did you complete it, right? Do you have something to show for it? And ultimately, you know, I'd say we need both, right? Without the day sect, we would just do what is comfortable and, you know, we wouldn't make anything of our life. But without the night sect, right, we would just achieve for other people and we wouldn't even enjoy it. And so this is just another exercise or a way to kind of try on or understand how to work with the planets of various sect, right? So the sun you could see as, right, helping with action for the self, Jupiter, action for your beliefs, Saturn, action for duty, Moon being about trusting your body and their sensations and intuitions, Venus trusting our desires and the things we're drawn towards, and Mars trusting our anger, right? Trusting that it's an energy and that it's a sign that something, we feel like something is wrong and that's worth addressing, even if we don't fully understand it or it doesn't fully adhere to logic. Let's see. So I really am a proponent, as you can probably tell, of visioning and journaling and really understanding sect as a scene. Right. Something that really helped me understand being a Leo rising night chart is what is a manifestation of the sun during the night, right? Could it be a candle or fireworks, right? Or the stars? I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that the fixed stars are a huge part of my practice as a nocturnal Leo rising. Then you can also, right, kind of, you can use the various characters I ascribe to the different sects and, figure out what sort of scene or what sort of narrative is created, from their point of view, right? Say that you're a diurnal person ruled by Venus, right? What would an epic quest from the point of view of the damsel or the maiden look like, right? I want to read that story, that's for sure. And then with that, for diurnal charts, right, consider how your relationships, emotions, unconscious life, daily adornment, right, nocturnal things, right, how can they support your core identity and external journey? And then for nocturnal charts, consider how your actions, achievements, intellect, and work within systems can support or be led by your internal experience, interdependence, and relationship to the mystery. But ultimately, and this will always be my line, is trust your unique way, right? Trust what resonates with you, what feels good for you, and don't be afraid to experiment, right? I hope that this gives you permission to know that, like, built into our chart is ease and difficulty and success and failure, and what joy to be able to really do both. So of course, right, this is just a taste of what you will find in my sect guidebook. Virtually everything you find here, I go even deeper into in this volume, including deep dive in how to delineate your chart using sect. I have particular chapters on the contours of the day and night, from like a more poetic perspective to more kind of concrete of this is what it's like being a day chart, this is what it's like being a night chart, including how each of the planets function in and out of sect. I get into what it's like to be ruled by an out of sect planet and give you some ideas of how to work with that. And so much more. Please check that out on my website. But for now, let's, get into any questions. Hopefully this was digestible, wasn't too difficult to understand. But yeah, I just want to open it up if anyone else has particular things I want to ask. Please refrain from specific to you chart questions. That is what a consult is for. But yeah, if there's anything else you want answered, feel free to drop them in the chat. And if not, then I'll just assume that I explained everything perfectly. Yes. So just so everyone knows, this will be uploaded. I have been screen recording the whole time because I anticipated that YouTube would be a problem. So I will work on getting that up to my website and making that accessible to everyone as soon as possible. So yeah, so Katie asks, Earth and water as nocturnal. So would that be like Mars and water signs rejoicing? Yes, exactly. Which I find interesting because, right, Mars in Cancer in a night chart, right, which is Mars in its fall, is still rejoicing, right? And that's just something to think about. Is like a Mars in the bottom of the well being like, I love it here. Anything else? Okay. If no one else has any questions, then I think I will end this. Yeah. Thank you all for attending. I hope that I brought you a lot of things to think about and be excited about, to really sink your teeth into both, the basics of sect, but also some steps to go beyond and consider, right, how sect works in the weird, complex ecosystem that is your whole chart. And yeah, like I said, I am maybe a little farther along than y'all, but this is really such an open field. There's so much more to explore. I mean, and I hope that this inspires you to do so. Feel free at any time to reach out with any other questions. But otherwise than that, thank you everyone for attending. And yeah, I hope that you got what you need. And yeah, this will be up hopefully within the next day if you want to replay for all to see. So thanks so much. Bye. Thank you.